The runner who couldn't run anymore. Phil Knight was not born into greatness. He chased it. In the quiet suburbs of Portland, Oregon, a young Phil would lace up his worn-out running shoes every morning before the sun had even kissed the rooftops, pounding the pavements with dreams that seemed too big for the boy who ran in silence. He wasn't chasing medals for glory or applause. He was running because it was the only time he felt free, the only time he felt like the world made sense. Yet, in his chest burned a quiet desperation, the kind that only those who have tasted failure can truly understand. He wanted to be the best, but every race told him otherwise. He wasn't fast enough, he wasn't strong enough, and with every finish line he crossed behind others, the bitter taste of reality settled deeper into his bones. For years, he pushed himself beyond exhaustion, convinced that hard work alone could rewrite fate. But fate had other plans. Injuries began to stalk him like a shadow, first a dull ache in the knee, then a stabbing pain in his shins, until finally, a doctor looked him in the eye and told him the words that shattered everything. "You need to stop running, or you won't walk without pain." For Phil, that wasn't just the end of running. It felt like the end of who he was. The track had been his sanctuary, his identity, his way of proving to himself that he could be more than the quiet boy from Oregon. Without it, he was lost. He graduated from college feeling like a man without a compass, carrying a degree in business but no clear direction, haunted by the unshakable feeling that he had been born to chase something, but that something had just been taken away. Nights were the worst. He would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying races in his head, not the ones he had won, but the ones he had lost. He thought about the sweat, the cheers, the sound of his own breath, the sting of defeat, and the emptiness that followed. That emptiness began to harden into something else, something dangerous, something powerful, a hunger. If he couldn't win on the track, maybe he could win somewhere else. But where? How? That question gnawed at him until one day, sitting in his small room surrounded by stacks of running magazines, he stumbled upon a thought so wild it almost scared him. What if I could create something better? Shoes, faster, lighter, stronger than anything on the market. Shoes that could give another runner the edge he never had. It wasn't just a business idea, it was a shot at redemption, a way to carve his name into a world that had closed its doors on him. But even as the idea burned brighter, another truth loomed like a storm cloud. Phil had no money, no factory, no connections, and not a single clue about how to make a shoe. All he had was the heart of a failed athlete and the stubborn refusal to stay down. That was when he made the decision that would change everything. He would take a leap so big, so absurd, that failure would almost be guaranteed, but if by some miracle it worked, it would rewrite his destiny forever. The journey nobody believed in. Phil Knight's leap into the unknown began not with a factory or a design team, but with a one-way ticket to Japan and a stubborn idea that had been gnawing at him for months. He believed that the future of running shoes lay in the hands of companies far away from America, places where innovation was happening quietly, unnoticed by the West. Sitting in his cramped airplane seat, knees pressed against the tray table, Phil carried nothing but a suitcase, a few sketches, and the weight of everyone's doubt. His family thought he was chasing a fantasy. His friends laughed about the shoe guy, who had never made a shoe. Even his old track coach, Bill Bowerman, though intrigued, had offered nothing more than a half-interested, "We'll see." But Phil wasn't doing this to prove them wrong. He was doing it because something inside him would not rest until he tried. When he landed in Tokyo, the city was a blur of neon signs, strange smells, and a language he couldn't understand. He walked into the Onitsuka Tiger headquarters, a small, modest office, his palms sweating through his suit jacket. He had no appointment, no translator, and no backup plan. Somehow, in a blend of nervous charm and desperate confidence, he convinced the executives to hear his pitch, importing their shoes into America. They agreed, reluctantly, to give him a small test order. It was a victory, but only the first crack in a wall that would take years to break down. Back in the U.S., Phil sold shoes out of the trunk of his car, driving from track meet to track meet, leaning on every relationship he had from his running days. The work was exhausting and humiliating. There was no glamour, no instant success, just long days of rejection, skeptical customers, and the ever-present threat that his tiny inventory would rot in his garage if he couldn't sell it. Yet, with every sale, no matter how small, Phil felt something he hadn't felt in years. Momentum. It was slow, but it was real. Bowerman, seeing the potential, offered to partner with him, bringing not only his coaching reputation but also his obsessive tinkering with shoe designs. Together, they formed Blue Ribbon Sports, the seed from which Nike would one day grow. But in those early days, the seed looked more like a burden. Bills piled up faster than orders, and there were nights Phil sat at his kitchen table surrounded by paperwork, wondering if he was just building another track for someone else to run on. The doubts were relentless. Competitors laughed at their garage operation, banks refused to give him loans, and Onitsuka often treated them like an afterthought. But Phil had learned something from all those years on the track. You don't stop running because you're tired. You stop when you're done. And he wasn't done. Not even close. What he didn't know was that the road ahead would demand far more than persistence. It would demand a kind of fight that had nothing to do with shoes and everything to do with survival. Fighting on empty. The early 1970s were supposed to be the years when blue ribbon sports finally broke through, but instead, they became the years that almost broke Phil Knight. Orders were coming in faster than ever before, and on the surface, it looked like the company was growing, but growth was a double-edged sword. Every shoe they sold required money they didn't have to make the next batch, and the faster they sold, the deeper into debt they fell. Phil found himself living in a strange kind of nightmare. The more successful they appeared, the closer they were to collapse. Banks saw only risk and turned him away, one after another. There were mornings when he would wake up with his chest tight, wondering if that day would be the one when everything came crashing down. He couldn't show that fear to his employees, many of whom had left stable jobs because they believed in him, but inside, he felt like a man sprinting toward a cliff with no way to stop. Onitsuka, their Japanese supplier, wasn't making things easier. The partnership was fraying at the edges. Shipments were late, quality was inconsistent, and whispers began to reach Phil that Onitsuka was quietly looking for other American distributors. It was betrayal in slow motion, and Phil knew if they lost Onitsuka, they wouldn't just lose their product, they'd lose the entire business. He began spending nights in his small office, not because there was work to do, though there always was, but because going home meant facing the silence, and in that silence, the doubts screamed louder. His marriage was under strain, friendships were wearing thin, and the weight of responsibility pressed on him like a vice. He was in his 30s but looked older, the kind of tired that sleep couldn't fix. And yet, even as the cracks widened, there was a stubborn flame in him that refused to go out. Every rejection from the bank was met with another plan, another phone call, another meeting. Every hint of betrayal from Onitsuka made him more determined to find a way out from under their control. Bill Bowerman's relentless drive was a mirror to his own. They would experiment with new soles, new materials, anything that could give them an edge. In the middle of chaos, Phil realized something profound. His fight wasn't just about shoes anymore. It was about proving that someone like him, a failed athlete with no safety net, could go toe-to-toe with the giants of the industry and not blink first. But to do that, he would need to take a step so risky it could either save everything or destroy it all in an instant. That step was coming, whether he was ready or not. Breaking away. The whispers of betrayal from Onitsuka turned into hard truth when Phil discovered they had been quietly setting up meetings with other potential U.S. distributors, effectively preparing to cut Blue Ribbon Sports out of the picture. 4 years, Phil had been the middleman, selling someone else's shoes, living in constant fear that one bad shipment or one bad meeting would destroy everything he'd built. Now that fear had a face, and it was staring straight back at him. He knew that if Onitsuka succeeded in replacing them, there would be no mercy, no second chance, no time to start over. Blue Ribbon would be dead before the ink dried on any new deal they made. But instead of panicking, Phil made a decision that would forever alter the trajectory of his life. He would no longer rely on anyone else to give him the product that defined his company. If they could take it away, then he would make his own. No safety net. No guarantees. Just his own brand, his own shoes, built from the ground up. It was a terrifying thought. Blue Ribbon had no factories, no infrastructure, no proven track record as a manufacturer, but they had ideas, and they had the kind of desperation that breeds creativity. He brought the team together, a small group who believed in the mission enough to work insane hours for little pay, and they started sketching. The designs were bold, untested, unlike anything on the market. Phil's goal wasn't just to survive. It was to create a shoe that could make an athlete faster, lighter, more unstoppable. Bill Bowerman became the mad scientist in the back rooms, cutting up shoes, gluing them back together, experimenting with soles in his kitchen, and even famously using a waffle iron to create a revolutionary tread pattern. When the first prototypes arrived, they weren't perfect, but they were theirs. For the first time, Phil felt like he wasn't running someone else's race. He was on his own track, setting his own pace. They needed a name, something that captured the spirit of speed and victory. And then, in a twist of fate, it came to them in a flash. Nike. Named after the Greek goddess of victory, it was short, sharp, unforgettable. Alongside it came the now iconic swoosh, sketched by a young design student for just $35, a mark that would one day become one of the most recognizable symbols on the planet. But in that moment, it wasn't legend yet. It was just a gamble, one of many Phil had made in a life full of them. Launching Nike meant war with Onitsuka, lawsuits, financial battles, and sleepless nights. Yet as the first pairs rolled out, something shifted. Phil could feel it in the way athletes reacted when they laced them up, in the way the shoes seemed to speak to people beyond just utility. This wasn't just business anymore. It was personal. Every mile run in a pair of Nikes was a quiet middle finger to the people who said he'd never make it. But even as the orders began to grow and the brand started to carve out its identity, Phil had no idea that the biggest turning point, the twist that would change everything, was still waiting just around the corner. The twist that nearly killed Nike. Just when Phil Knight thought he had finally escaped the shadow of Onitsuka and carved his own lane with Nike, a storm began to brew, one far more dangerous than lawsuits or late shipments. It came not from competitors or factories, but from the very thing that had driven Nike's early success: growth. Orders were pouring in faster than they could make shoes, and Nike was running on razor-thin margins, taking on loan after loan just to keep up with demand. Phil had gambled everything on the idea that if they could just keep running forward, they'd eventually outrun the danger. But danger has a way of catching up. One morning, a bank that had been their lifeline called with devastating news. They were pulling Nike's line of credit. Overnight, the company had no access to the funds it needed to pay factories, ship products, or cover payroll. For a few terrifying days, Nike stood on the edge of oblivion. Employees didn't know if they'd be paid, suppliers demanded money they didn't have, and Phil found himself staring at a future where everything he had fought for, every late night, every risk, every mile, would vanish. But here was the twist. In the middle of the chaos, an unlikely opportunity emerged. A Japanese trading company, Nissho EY, stepped in, willing to bet on Nike when no one else would. They offered financing that no American bank dared to give, not because they believed in Phil's balance sheet, but because they believed in his conviction. This wasn't charity, it was business, but it was also the lifeline Nike needed to survive. That deal kept the lights on, the shoes moving, and the dream alive. And yet, it came with its own kind of pressure. Now Nike had to deliver on a scale it had never faced before. Phil took the risk, knowing that if they stumbled, there would be no second rescue. That moment, when salvation came from a completely unexpected place, was the heartbeat of Nike's story. It wasn't about a smooth climb to the top, it was about dancing on the edge of collapse and still finding the courage to take the next step. Looking back, Phil would call it one of the defining moments of his life, not just because it saved Nike, but because it proved something he had always believed deep down. Victory doesn't belong to the fastest, the strongest, or even the smartest. It belongs to the ones who refuse to quit, no matter how many times the world tells them they're finished. And for Phil Knight, the failed athlete who could no longer run, Nike had become the race he was born to win.